Good afternoon, Neil. How are you?
I'm very well, Barry, and you?
I'm very well. Good to be doing this again. It's been a little while.
It's been much too long.
You and I have spent the last 45 minutes just chatting through the whole subject of forgiveness.
We have, yes.
Which has led us to realise how complex an area it is.
Not only complex, but fascinating in a way.
Absolutely fascinating.
Just extraordinary and needed. And we also delving into our own understandings of it and realising that it's not as... you can see the different definitions, different ways of looking at it. So,
well, we're very grateful to have Marina Cantacuzino on the show this afternoon.
To clarify it all for us.
Who... Tell us a bit about her project.
The Forgiveness Project, yes, which is a marvellous organisation, a UK charity, not-for-profit organisation that sets out through storytelling to explore how ideas around forgiveness, reconciliation and conflict resolution can be used to impact positively on people's lives through their personal testimony of both the victims and the perpetrators of crime and violence.
Well, this is fascinating, isn't it? Using storytelling in such a powerful domain.
And storytelling, we're talking about the stories of people who have been through this, aren't we? We're talking about real life stories.
Yes. And we're going to start. Marina, good afternoon.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
We'd like to start as a jumping off point. We'd like to take one of the quotes that you make from the book, which is this: everyone's response to forgiveness, or their definition of it, is valid because forgiveness is something viewed through a personal lens, and every context and all content is therefore dissimilar. Could you expand on that a bit for us through your experience and everything you've been learning about forgiveness over the last however many years it is now?
Yes, indeed. I started sort of tackling this complex subject about 13 years ago, and I soon realised, because fundamental to the project I started was talking to people and gathering their personal narratives. And it soon became very clear that everyone had a different definition, and everyone had a different story, and everyone had different parameters and limits to forgiveness. And there was no one single definition. And philosophers and academics and religious leaders had written great tomes on forgiveness. And even they, it's highly contested territory.
Yeah.
And so that kind of fascinated me, that no one really could agree on what it was, because it's so personal and individual, and I remain convinced that's still the case. It became very clear to me early on in the first year of collecting stories, and I've actually become more and more confused in a good way, I have to say. So,
yes. Do you think there's one thing that struck me, and we were talking about beforehand, is that sometimes you hear people who forgive very quickly. Something happens, they go, I forgive this person. And so, sometimes it feels like, and I'm not making a judgment on this other than just observing it, that forgiveness actually involves a process, and there is an emotional process that perhaps needs to happen. Or do you think perhaps not? I mean, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's very individual. So there are people, I think, who surprise themselves, and for them, I would say, very instantly, they line themselves up for forgiveness, and it's almost an innate response to trauma and hurt and harm. It's like this is what they have to do, and their gut is telling them, not their head.
Okay.
And I think there are other people who go from their head, and that's maybe what you're talking about, which you might call premature forgiveness.
Right.
But in a way, it's still an intention, and it's still lining yourself up. I mean, I agree, sometimes it feels like that person maybe has been told by a spiritual leader, or maybe feels they should, or for some reason, but you just think you've got to be full of rage, surely. And I think that you could call that premature forgiveness, but I think, it's not a judgment, because I think it's absolutely fine whatever route people want to take, basically.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Marina, what led you into this inquiry? How on earth did you find yourself? Because if I'm right, your background is as a journalist. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, I had been a freelance journalist for many years.
So what led you into
feature writer.
This?
And yeah, it was the Iraq War, because I felt, in a way, I was in my early 40s, and it was the thing that politicised me more than anything. I felt incensed, and you could say that anger led me to forgiveness, because I went on the march in 2003. And I was full of rage, and I felt that this was the wrong thing to do, that the more you come down on people and groups, the more they re-emerge in a more resistant and angry way. And so I thought, well, what can I do as a journalist? And the only thing I could do, because I was travelling quite a lot with the Red Cross and Oxfam, writing stories for them, and I thought in my spare time when I'm travelling and I was with a photographer, perhaps we could collect stories of reconciliation, forgiveness, conflict resolution, people's personal journeys, to explore a bit more how people didn't respond in a retaliatory way and why. And that's how it began. It was a very private project. We did it in our spare time. We thought it might become a one-off magazine article or something like that.
Little did you know.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, little did I know the fascination with the subject of forgiveness. Well, it became an exhibition, in fact, because Anita Roddick, who sadly since died, but she saw the raw material we created, and she was just so moved by them, the stories. She said, you have to do something more with this than an article. And she gave us funding to make it up into an exhibition, which we called the F word, because, as you've heard, I've become convinced it was a very confusing, difficult word.
Yeah.
And that was launched in January in 2004 at the Oxford Gallery in London. I thought my life would go back to journalism, but the interest was immense. You know, nothing I'd been involved in my life before. And I tackled some difficult subjects. I'd even done a big exhibition on mental health. You know, everything had had its time, and I'd moved on and away from that subject. But this just wouldn't leave me alone. You know, the people were just fascinated, and they came in droves to the exhibition, and they said, what next, you know, what are you going to do with these stories? And out of that grew the Forgiveness Project.
I mean, actually, a straightforward question that I'd have is, what do you do with these stories? Are you actively going out somewhere and getting involved in projects with forgiveness, or are you promoting the stories to...
Well, our method really is narrative and storytelling. So we keep collecting stories, and we share them in multiple ways and across all sorts of different platforms. So, for instance, the basis of what we do, we have the website, which gets 500 visitors a day.
Would you like to give the address again, Marie, for people listening?
It's the Forgiveness Project, theforgivenessproject.com.
Thank you.
And we have the exhibition, The F Word, which has had several articulations now, and has been in 13 different countries. It's been translated. It's been seen by about 80,000 people in all sorts of different settings, from like the EU to prisons to shopping precincts to schools, community settings. And we have a downloadable schools resource which teachers can use in the classroom. And I've written a book, which is another way of getting things across. And
highly recommended.
Thank you.
Called The Forgiveness Project, isn't it, the book?
Yeah, it's called The Forgiveness Project, Stories for a Vengeful Age. And the other two things we do, we put on forgiveness conversations, which are events, and have an annual lecture. But we also have a Restore Prison programme, which uses real stories to go into prisons and share stories of transformation from both the victim survivor's point of view and an ex-offender. And it helps prisoners reframe and rebuild their lives. So that's a restorative justice intervention, you might say. So it's very varied what we do, as you can hear.
I just heard you saying the thing about a vengeful age, and I'm wondering what you feel about that, whether you feel we have changed into a vengeful age. And I'm struck a bit by Lord Tebbett's view on, you know, he's very unforgiving of the terrible bombing that he's left his wife paralysed. And he said, your project excuses, rewards and encourages murder, which is a pretty strong statement. And it seems to perhaps tie into this vengeful age thing too. And I just wonder if you had something to say about that. Yeah.
Well, I think firstly, Lord Tebbett is one of those people for whom he's not opposed to forgiveness per se. He's opposed to what you would call unconditional forgiveness, which is where forgiveness is an act of self-healing. You do it for yourself. It doesn't matter if the perpetrator has shown no remorse or is dead or whatever. He would be open to even forgiving Patrick McGee, the man who planted that Brighton bomb, if he felt he showed adequate remorse and apology. and acknowledged his crimes. So that hasn't happened. Therefore, he's very against anyone giving a platform to Patrick McGee. And Patrick talks with Joe Berry, whose father was also killed in that bomb. Yep. And they have this restorative dialogue, which I feel is worth sharing. Yep. But in reply to your question about vengeful age, I think if you look statistically, we're no more violent than we've ever been, possibly even less. Mm. But I think there's a difference in that the rhetoric of hate seems louder than ever. This may be amplified through social media and through all these new channels that we have. It's certainly spoken by, certain politicians like Trump. He's a very black and white politician. And I think people feel they have a license to spout nastiness and hate and division and insularity in a way that I think is just building and building. So this is why I feel these, you could call them humanizing stories that we share, are a very powerful antidote to the dehumanization that is going around all around us.
Mm. I'd like to pick up on one of the themes that I've noticed in some of the stories that came through, Marina, and which you point to. And in a way, I'd like to start with the Brené Brown TED Talk, which I gather is is a favourite of yours as well. But it's around the subject of the danger of us being so certain about our views.
Yes.
And there's a point in the book where you're quoting an Israeli doctor, and I think I'm not quite sure which conference he was at, but I think you quote him as saying the most precarious thing for peace is believing you have all the answers.
Yes. I heard that very early on when I was, on this journey, as it were, and it really struck me. And then the more I delve into, people's trauma and pain and hurt that people have to deal with and reconcile with, the more unhelpful I think it is when people tell them you must do this and you must do that. Or Marshall Rosenberg, who's non-violent communication guy, said that should was the most violent word in the English language. And it's a very difficult one, because I heard Richard Holloway, who's fantastic, ex-former Bishop of Edinburgh, he said, we must be careful not to be too certain about our uncertainty. And I thought that was brilliant, because I can be a little bit too certain about this, my belief in uncertainty, because I love the quote, that Rumi, Sufi poet, says, out beyond right and wrong, there is a place. I will meet you there. But it's hard, it's very, very hard to be so open. And there are times when you need to be strong and stand up for injustices and such.
Absolutely. But there's also this point, isn't there, which is I'm researching my own work at the moment, and one of the interesting things I came across was the whole nature of what they call the illusion of explanatory depth. Are you aware of that?
No.
Okay. So it's fascinating, because what scientists, they started off by, a group of scientists started off by getting some people to describe how they thought things worked. And first of all, they'd ask them to rate their understanding. So they'd rate it in a certain way, and then they'd ask them to describe how it worked, and then they'd get them to rate their understanding afterwards. So of course, I know how a hairdryer works, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, or whatever. Okay, now describe how it works to me. Now rate it how well you understand it. And that was an interesting starting point. Obviously, they were rating their understanding much lower. So another group of researchers thought, this is really interesting, we'll take this into the political field. So they started to ask people who were very fixed in their views on certain, a party and the policies they wanted to put through in the states. They started with. And they said, how well do you think you know this policy well, or how keen are you to have this policy, or, very keen. Okay, and then they asked one control group to say how it aligned to their values, so to speak, how it aligned to them. And then they rated their again, the significance of that policy afterwards, and how determined they were to align themselves to it. And then they asked a second group to rate how committed they were to the policy and that party. They then asked them to explain how the policy worked. And they then asked them to rate how committed they were to it afterwards. And the people who had to explain their understanding, their ratings changed dramatically. Their views softened. And I'm really interested by what you, because it's so correlates with what I'm writing at the moment and exploring, and I know through my client work, which is that when we allow ourselves to acquire more information, when we move away from these fixed viewpoints, it seems that in some ways we soften our extreme views. And I'm interested to know whether you've experienced that through your research and the stories that you've gathered as well, because I seem to see it as a theme in places.
Oh, yes. And I mean, it fits in very much to many of the stories that I've gathered. And my understanding of the forgiveness process is that the more you understand the pain of the other, the enemy, the person you hate, the person who's harmed you, the less able you are to hate them. So empathy building will soften hardened perspectives without question.
Okay.
And I would say, when I look at forgiveness, sometimes people say, what's the process? And of course, I don't think there's a linear process, but there are components and values that people have. And, empathy building is one of them. Understanding is. Curiosity is. I think curiosity is a powerful antidote to hate. It's all part of what you're talking about, softening these hardened views that we have, as is self-knowledge and self-discovery, and because if you have self-hatred, you do damage in the world. So and then of course transforming hate. These are the components of forgiveness. But what you talk about is very relevant. It's in there.
Thank you. I'd like a slightly different angle on that. I read Anna Barry's daughter's dissertation for her degree on forgiveness around Joe Berry. And one of the things that struck me, because I work a lot with grief in some work I do in grieving, and I really felt there was a correlation between the grieving process and being open to grieving and being open to forgiveness, in that unless we're able to meet that which is lost and go through the depth of feeling that we have around that, I mean, I'm not, I'm obviously, it's maybe a personal view, it felt very related anyway to forgiveness and that letting go process. And I don't know whether you have any feelings on that.
No, I think that's absolutely right, because I think unless one of the key things really to let it go is to be able to go through your rage and your grief and your anger and to really own it, feel it, speak it, and not deny it or bury it. And I think it's very in line with the grieving process, the forgiveness process. There's a fantastic book called Unattended Sorrow by Stephen Levine. I don't know if you've read it, but it's about...
Not that one, but no, Stephen Levine, yes. Okay.
Yeah, and he writes a lot about grief, and forgiveness comes in big time into his books.
Right.
Because of the healing process.
So it's almost an outcome, isn't it, of forgiveness, as opposed to a necessarily decision, or maybe not. I mean, I heard earlier that you said that it could be anything, but in a sense it's an outcome of having been through the process of letting go.
I think so, and also I like to see it as an intention almost, because you may not quite get there, but it's about having a different kind of behaviour and perspective. And one person put it as sort of lining herself up for forgiveness. So every day is a constant, battle in a way. Will I get there? It's not a fixed thing. It's not a one-off event. It's continuum, and it changes. Joe Berry says, that one day, something may happen and I may hate all over again. You just never know what's going to trigger it.
Absolutely.
Do you think you are actually forgiving another, or it's more of an internal process of forgiving something internally or letting go of something?
Well, I think, both. I mean, forgiveness that people do say if you can't forgive yourself or have self-compassion, you can't forgive others or have compassion for others. And I think it is very interlinked in that way. But equally, if someone has wronged you, and, whether that's a, relatively small or a massive thing, and you are fixated by it, you go to bed at night thinking about it, and you go, wake up the next morning, you're still thinking about it and ruminating on this thing that then becomes dominant in your life, and you're really a victim to the event or the person who's hurt you, then it is just a severing of that. Now, it doesn't mean reconciliation. It may, but it doesn't necessarily. It's about reconciling with hurt and harm and not allowing the pain of the past dictate the path of the future.
Marina, how do you bring everything that you're learning through this extraordinary inquiry, how do you bring that into your daily life?
Well, it's interesting because, I don't know. I've been on various, because I like to learn what other people do around forgiveness. So we don't offer a course or anything, but I've gone on various workshops and things. You're always asked to think about an incident, a person, something you can't forgive, a family member, etc. And I always really struggle. And I'm lucky in that respect, I think. But am I lucky? Or am I someone that has avoided conflict? Or am I good at building peace around me? It's hard to know. I don't attract very much conflict into my life, or certainly don't hate anyone. I don't have resentment. So I feel very fortunate in that respect. But obviously the little things that go on all the time, and you have children, I'll give you an example. My son is away, and he sent me a text recently, and he said he thought Theresa May was evil. So I had to go back to him. I'm not a fan, actually, of Theresa May, but I said, I don't think about using that word evil, because actually you're othering her to such an extent that she becomes a monster and something different to you. Is that true, And look at her behaviour. It was all around the fire. Look at her behaviour. She looks a haunted individual to me. Can you have some compassion, possibly? So, these are the conversations we have at home.
Yes. Do you think, one of the things that's just come up for me there is that quite often it's a past hurt that creates a present sort of projection onto somebody and no forgiveness, if you see what I mean. It's not always straightforward between the individuals involved. Do you have any stories that work around that? You mean?
I suppose. Are you talking about people for whom the historical pains might determine how they act?
I work with doing something called The Journey, for example, and I work with people's sort of childhood trauma, for example. And for example, if someone was, let's say, mistreated by their parents, or let's say their mother, for example, and then they grow up and a similar sort of scenario exists, a lot of that sort of anger and hatred against the mother would get projected perhaps onto the girlfriend, let's say, and it's quite an entrenched thing. Yes,
since I started the Forgiveness Project in 2004, we've had loads of people write to us and ring us up and send us books and poems that they've published, and the biggest theme is that one of childhood sexual abuse or rape or sexual violence and assault. And I think that's because often there are no systems of accountability here, and people go through decades often of putting that pain, whether it's self-harm or outward into the world, and they come to a point, I think they come to us because they come to a point they're looking for another way. It hasn't worked for them. And so these are the people who can reflect the kind of thing you're saying, but are able to talk about it as wanting to break that cycle.
And when you say come to us, do you offer a counselling type thing then, or
no? They may think that we do, but what we do is we have as I say, we have events and we have themes. Like last week, we did one around sexual violence, and it did attract people who had been harmed in that way. And we always look at it through the lens of forgiveness, conflict resolution, healing in some way. So the people who come to us would be wanting some guidance, but very often we put them onto other more therapeutic interventions, or we say, why don't you look at this story? Because on the website, it seems silly in a way that one story can have an impact, but I've had so much proof now that actually even one story can be the start of a journey. That's what we do.
Yeah, which is fantastic. We can't underestimate the significance of one person's story, can we?
No.
And these stories obviously are needed in the current extraordinarily intense world situation. And I'm just wondering, are you noticing more people becoming interested in your work? Is it a growing, snowballing thing?
It is a bit of a movement, and we're certainly not the only people like this. I know. It's hard to tell, but I think it's a little bit more mainstream than it was 13 years ago. in the sense that which is good in one sense, it's less of a news story. You might notice yourself that actually in the media there's increasingly stories about forgiveness and reconciliation. The media like those stories because they offer some kind of redemption and hope. And whatever we think of the media, they recognise that actually people are more likely to read something that offers them something than plain negativity. So we definitely notice that we're getting more interested in our work. Yes.
Do you have a vision for how that work can enter the system, so to speak? I'm noticed in the foreword, Alexander McCall Smith, when he's talking on the criminal justice system, isn't he? And he says forgiveness is provided resolutions that the system could not achieve. Well, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could get a system that could achieve those sorts of resolutions by including forgiveness? Do you have a vision as to how that could happen, Marina?
Well, I suppose my background's journalism, so my vision has always been around changing the conversation in many different ways. I think, you see, the forgiveness is also a really problematic word for people. They still see it, barnacled by aeons of piety, and they see it as a religious concept.
Absolutely.
To imagine that, beyond somewhere like South Africa or Hawaii, or, that it would actually get spoken about by politicians is too far a leap, really. But I think restorative justice and those restorative processes are much more able to be taken into the mainstream, and indeed have been, in that it is now government policy to offer restorative justice, the meeting of victim offender to repair a community harm. That is being taken and promoted. So I see our work really is working on one story at a time, one mind at a time, one heart at a time, and creating a kind of ripple effect in that respect.
And I remember back, which is quite a while ago now, the Truth and Reconciliation work in South Africa, which seemed at the time to me utterly inspiring, and yet it doesn't seem to have been replicated, to my knowledge anyway, anywhere else, and we certainly could do with it. Am I wrong in thinking it hasn't been replicated? Or...
You are wrong in that there are actually quite a few, but they're small and community-led, and I'm sure, I don't know that much, but for instance, there's one in Canada to do with the institutional boarding schools that the Aboriginal people were taken away, young children over the last 4 decades, were taken out of their homes and put in boarding schools, and the whole identity strip. So there's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission going on there at the moment. I believe, and many others, and some have success and some don't. So it was a model, but there's none that has been as big as that. You're actually right, and had such a dramatic effect.
Do you get approaches, Marina, from government?
Other than to come and, show a film or talk about our prison work when we did some evidence about it, or do a presentation to an all-party parliamentary group. Nothing more than that. No.
Okay.
So and obviously it'd be good to get more of governments involved, and also individuals. If people want to get involved, if people are feeling and listening and thinking, I'd like to get involved or give something to your organisation or whatever, what could they do?
Well, I think they should look at the website, which again is theforgivenessproject.com, and all our contact details are there, and they get an idea about what we do and the sort of events and resources we have, and then just get in touch.
Can I say about the website, for anyone listening, it is so easy to navigate around, and the way that you've lined the stories up and they're under, in the categories and everything, it's very simple to find your way to a story that will inspire you according to your needs. So I would highly recommend that people do visit that. And well done, Marina, with actually framing that in that way, because websites can be an infinite sort of journey sometimes.
Yes, that's very true. Thank you.
They're about the right length as well, aren't they? You don't.
Absolutely. The stories are great. Yeah. Well, I would expect that, wouldn't we? Just exploring again a little bit deeper with forgiveness itself, and how different people have approached it in very difficult situations. Samantha Lawler, the story of Samantha Lawler, whose father murdered her mother, and you describe in the book. She says forgiveness is not about forgiving the act, but it's about forgiving the imperfections which are inherent in all of us. Have you found that to be a fairly unique point of view, or has that been something that has come through more and more of the victims' stories?
No, it's a fairly common view. Maybe I thought she articulated it really well,
Beautifully.
Yes, and particularly where a monstrous act, particularly unpleasant, and atrocity has happened, or atrocity. But I mean, another way of putting that. For instance, a guy called Kemal Pavanish, who's like from Bosnia and was in one of the concentration camps and was tortured by people who had been his teachers, and many of his friends were killed, etc.
Yeah.
He says, talking about the perpetrators now down the line, he says people describe these men as monsters born with a genetically mutant gene, but I don't believe that. I believe every human being is capable of killing. And that's what you come to, because what circumstances would it take for us to do similar things? There's this good quote by a guy called Philip Zimbardo, who's written books on this, and he says like, with public fear notched up and the enemy threat imminent, reasonable people act irrationally, independent people act in mindless conformity, and peaceful people act as warriors. So in other words, if our children were being threatened, if our lives were being threatened, what would we do? And I think the people in this project, the Forgiveness Project, somehow have that broader perspective that they can stand in the shoes of what might it be like to be that other person.
I think that was what came through so strongly from Jo Berry when we first interviewed her all those years ago. And she describes, and she coming out of that meeting with Pat and being able to say, who's to say that, given his upbringing, given his conditioning, his environment, who's to say I wouldn't have done exactly the same thing?
I think there's a drive for black and white, isn't there? Like if you see the press, it's like there's good and bad, or what have you, or at least certainly the tabloid press, and it feels like there's this denial of, of shadow or whatever. That the desire not to see that capability in ourselves is part of the issue, really, that we want to push it onto somebody else. Yes, absolutely, and. Also, there's another of our storytellers is called Bjorn, and he was a survivor of the Anders Breivik attack in Norway. And he was sort of saying to me, he finds it really, he actually said, I find it scary, people's efforts to dehumanize Breivik, because that's just what he tried to do to us. When they call him a monster, and he just says he tries to see him as a human being, and of course people find that very tricky that he does that, because they prefer to see him as a monster. Maybe we're both pointing over here at the Solzhenitsyn quote, which I'll read quickly, just so because it's such brilliant on that front, really. Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, not between classes, not between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. This line shifts. Inside us it oscillates with the years, and even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of all hearts there remains an unuprooted small corner of evil. And I think,
that's brilliant.
It's just,
Yeah, I discovered that quote a little after, maybe a year or two into the Forgiveness Project, and I just seemed to sum up everything that I believed and what I was trying to do.
The use of the language there, though, is fantastic, isn't it? And as you say, it sums up this very complicated subject that we're kind of grappling with. And when I talk about forgiveness to my clients, Marina, I always find myself saying, all I understand about it, it's a way of life.
That's right.
It's a waking up every day with the question of what is forgiveness to me today, if you can. And some days you won't remember that question.
That's right. Yeah.
And for the poets listening, I just got to do this one last quote before we go to the next question, which is the Mark Twain one, which is just so beautiful, I think. And that's forgiveness is the fragrance that the violet sheds on the heel that has crushed it. And it's just such a lovely way of I mean, it's wonderful, I think.
I have to say, Marie, the book, it's just like, it's a reader's paradise, and I would recommend anyone listening. I haven't got shares in it. I would recommend anyone listening to buy it, because it literally is you can just dip, if you've got 2 minutes, you can dip into it, and you come away feeling uplifted.
Yeah, thank you.
So you're just wonderful work.
So we're getting near the end here, and we always want to know what guests would say if you were to go back to the 16-year-old you, and you were to give advice to her. What specific advice would you give?
Well, so the 16-year-old me was convinced that I would be unfulfilled in my creative abilities somehow, and that I wouldn't be able to do anything of value or meaning in my life. So I was full of doubt, let's put it that way.
Right.
So I think, and it caused me suffering. So I think I would like to be able to say, have faith and just keep going. And if you just keep going, no matter what, you'll get somewhere.
Brilliant. And you certainly have, and you are, and you still, and I'm sure you will be for a long time to come.
Yeah, I hope so.
One final question, Marina. I'm going to give you a magic wand. There's if there's one thing in this world you could change right now with this magic wand, what would it be?
It would be something alright when people, everyday people, spout out hate and vitriol and judgment, that they would also have the opportunity to hear the other side. Somehow.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Love it. Thank you so much for your time.
No, not at all. Lovely talking to you both.
Great.
And you.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
very much. Bye-bye.